Hey, anatomy people, my favorite topic on the planet. Today we're going to discuss anatomy in basically its most basic form, just getting to know the human body. This is an introductory video, so I'm going to walk you through the planes and quadrats and regions, and then we'll start getting into a little bit more detail about bones and muscles and how muscles work. This is just a big overview of anatomy, what it means, and then we'll start to move into a little bit more detail. This is the Vitruvian Man. I'm not sure if you know this picture, but it's one of the most famous pieces of art on the planet, Leonardo da Vinci, and he called it the Vitruvian Man. And we use it in anatomy because it's supposed to be the most perfect drawing of the most perfectly symmetrical human. And it reminds me a lot of yoga because yoga is all about balance and symmetry. But we use this in anatomy because all of the surface anatomical terms that we use when we're studying the human body are related to this particular stance. So you're standing up, your palms are forward, and your legs are a little bit apart. So we'll come back to this, but I just want to plant this seed now and tell you that we'll use it again. All right, so let's get to know the human body, my most favorite topic on the planet. Love, love, love human anatomy. The human body is so unbelievably complex and incredibly delicate, also just incredibly resilient. All of those things together, make us who we are. And I like to tell my college students, all we are really are just walking chemical factories. And that's true because really our skin is our vessel. And we talk about this a lot in yoga, right, with the koshas. And the outermost layer of our kosha is the physical body, which fuels and feeds all of those inner shells. And so in anatomy, we're really focusing primarily on what's inside of the skin, even though the integument is the largest organ in the body and it houses lots of blood vessels and lots of nerves and lots of nerve endings that essentially drive our sensory system. So the skin is super important, but it really is this vessel that carries all the rest of us, which is essentially chemicals. Get right down to it, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. So what does anatomy mean? The derivation of the word anatomy is Greek, and it literally means to cut up. You can also say to anatomize or dissect. This is a photograph from Body Worlds, one of my most favorite art exhibits. I've followed it lots of places around the country when it shows up at museums. It's super cool if you ever get a chance to visit one of those Body Worlds. Definitely go. Because there's lots of really cool parts of the body and the way they display them with this process called plastination is pretty awesome. All right, so anatomy and physiology typically go hand in hand. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about this. It's not super important for yoga, but I think it's important enough to mention that even though anatomy and physiology do go hand in hand, they are considered different fields of science. Anatomy is essentially the study of the structure of the body, and physiology is the study of function of the human body. So physiology then becomes an experimental science, whereas anatomy is all based on observation. And if you remember the scientific method, you might remember, your teachers talking about observation, making a hypothesis, making an experiment, making your variables, analyzing your data, interpreting your data, writing up your results, drawing your conclusions, things like that. So all of those are components of the scientific method. But in anatomy, we don't use all of those components. We only use one, and that component is observation. So when you're studying the actual anatomical features of the body, you're interested in skin, heart, liver, and their functions. If you want to know more about experimental science and actually gather data, then it becomes more of a physiological question. So those would be questions like, why do you make more red blood cells when you climb Mount Everest, or why do you need that to happen? Or what happens to your red blood cells when you're trying to climb Mount Everest, right? They become oxygen depleted. Why does this happen? This is acclimatization, and so your body is making these changes as you move into these different environmental conditions. That's physiology. Okay. All right. So there are different branches of anatomy, And those branches range from microscopic to macroscopic. Microscopic anatomy is essentially anything that you have to see under a microscope. So you have to view these very small, tiny tissues and cells under the microscope because you can't see them with the naked eye. And then this moves us into the macroscopic anatomy, which are things that we can see. So we can dissect certain tissues, we can dissect muscles, we can see the organs, and anything we can see with the naked eye is considered to be macroscopic. Structural organization of the human body then entails all of that from the microscopic to the macroscopic scale. And it all starts with chemicals. So if you start with the very most basic level of the human body, it starts with atoms. And then of course atoms come together and they make molecules, and then molecules come together and they make cells. Cells start to come together and they make tissues. Tissues then come together to make organs. Organs come together to make organ systems. And then organ systems come together to make the human body, or an organism. And if you're thinking about like an ecosystem, it keeps going, right? Organisms, and then we make communities, populations, communities, biosphere. But in human anatomy, this is essentially the organization that we're interested in. And you can see why I said we're basically a walking chemical factory is basically what we are, you know, and all of these chemicals are interacting, they're doing these amazing things, and when they interact, they start to make cells, and then those cells start to come together and make certain types of tissues. And in the human body, there are different kinds of tissues. We have adipose tissue, which is fat, super important for yoga, right? Super important to have enough, but we don't want too much in the human body. And then, you know, there's other kinds of tissues as well. You have epithelial tissues like your skin. You have liver tissue, which is very specific to that particular organ, and lots of other types of tissue associated with the human body. And then tissues basically come together in sheets, and they're held together by these things called gap junctions. And when those sheets of tissues come together, they essentially start to form organs, like your liver, like your stomach, like your spleen. And then, of course, those organs all become very important in yoga and also in Chinese medicine because we essentially are targeting a lot of those organs in our yoga practice. And in Chinese medicine, they talk a lot about the specific organs and how they're responding to specific yoga poses. And then, of course, the organs all come together and they work in conjunction with other organs to make that particular system. For example, your digestive system. So your digestive system is going to include the stomach and the large intestine and the small intestine and the liver and the pancreas. And all of these organs have specific jobs within that system, but they're all working together. So they have these very, very intimate relationships that allow that system to function. But what's really cool and what is even more important in my opinion is that those systems, the different systems, so liver system or a digestive system or cardiovascular system, nervous system, endocrine system, all of those different systems, those all also work together. So they don't work mutually exclusively at all. They're all basically interacting all the time to do all the amazing things that make the human body the human body. Because the human body is amazing, right? I think we'll all agree. All right, this is just a little quiz slide so that you can use to test yourself to make sure that you know all about the structural organization from molecules all the way to the organism. And then this is a figure that goes into a little bit more detail about an example of what I was just talking about, where all of those systems start to come together and they interact in ways that make them very, very tightly linked to the point where they can't function without each other. So here's a couple of examples in this picture. So we could talk about this for days, okay? But we don't need to talk about it for days. We just need to draw in an example or two just to make sure that what I'm talking about is super clear. So let's take my two favorite systems. My first favorite system is probably the digestive system, just because I'm super interested in nutrition and metabolism and how your digestive system breaks down glucose from your food, which is the energy source that we get from our food. It's a simple sugar, and it's broken down basically to be metabolized into energy in the form of ATP. So I love the digestive system because it's super complicated, but simple in its goal, which is literally to turn sugar, you can do proteins and lipids, but primarily sugar, into fuel that fuels our daily activities. And I think that's really awesome. The digestive system works very closely together with the circulatory system, also the lymphatic system, super close to the nervous system, as well as the endocrine system. So if you think about the relationship between the digestive system and the circulatory system, which I also love, I love the lymphatic system too, but we don't need to go there. I don't need to get on that soapbox right now. But let's just take digestive system and circulatory system, and let's think about how those two systems are working together every single second of our life. So the digestive system takes in the energy from the food. So you eat whatever it is, let's say it's a date or whatever your favorite food is. That's my favorite food right now. I'm eating them constantly. So you eat a date, you chew it up. That date is full of complex carbohydrates. So then your body, mastication, the process of chewing, starts to break it down. Enzymes in your saliva, which is also part of the digestive system, start to further break it down, and then turns it into monomers, which means monomer, one piece or one part of that big long chain of sugars. And then of course there's millions of these, right, in every piece of fruit or every piece of food that we eat. So then your body is already starting to digest the food in the mouth with this process of mastication. But the enzymes are chemicals, and they're already starting to help break down those big chains of polysaccharides. Now your body, your digestive system, can't really do anything with big molecules. So that's why we have to chew our food first. The saliva has to come in and help break it down even more so that we can swallow the food and then help the stomach actually start to process those smaller sugars. So when we swallow the food, that's called a bolus, and the bolus goes down the esophagus into the stomach. Once the bolus is in the stomach, then it starts to churn because your stomach is full of acids. It's a very low pH environment, very difficult environment for bacteria and things like that to live in purposefully. So these enzymes also are there that start to help to break down the food even more. And once the food turns into that kind of liquidy paste, that's called chyme. Well, the chyme then starts to move through your small intestines, which is really, really long. And it takes its time moving through the small intestines because the small intestines have these little finger-like projections. Okay, so if you see a cross section of a small intestine, it basically looks like this. And the reason it looks like this is to increase the surface area, okay, of that organ, the small intestine. This is where the magic happens because now the cardiovascular system comes in, okay? This is that intimate relationship. So the cardiovascular system comes in by basically making this really intricate network of what we call capillaries. And capillaries are tiny little blood vessels. And so they interact with those finger-like projections, which are called villi. And then through those membranes, very thin membranes, the glucose from the chyme that needs to reach the cells so that the cells can turn it into energy literally transfers from those membranes into the blood. So this is all happening at the microscopic level. And so if you have, if you're malnourished or something like that, then something's not working, right? Your homeostatic balance is off somehow. Maybe your finger-like projections are shunted down. Some diseases will do that. That also aids in malnutrition, exacerbates malnutrition, things like that. So that's a very intimate relationship between two systems. And then of course it can go on and on too. We could keep talking about it. We don't need to. I think you get the point. But that glucose is now moved into the bloodstream. And then of course the glucose has to go out to all the cells, and then it feeds the cells break it apart, the cells use oxygen from your respiration. There's another very close link, right, to digestion, circulatory system, and respiration. And then the cells use the glucose to make energy in the form of ATP, and that's our primary fuel for the body. So that's essentially how digestion in a nutshell works. But what I really want you to appreciate as a yoga teacher is how intimate these relationships are between all the systems. And that's just one example. We could talk about so many different examples, but the appreciation for this tight linked relationship between all the systems is important for us to understand so that we're treating the human body holistically as opposed to mechanically. Like if you're looking at a car saying, oh, your engine is, something's wrong with the engine, let's replace the engine, and then everything else is fine. But the human body, doesn't work that way, and most of the time cars don't either, right? Things interact. And so as yoga teachers, obviously we don't need to be experts about all this stuff, but we need to have a basic understanding that these systems are very, very intimately related, and they do not work mutually exclusively. And this is one of the issues with Western medicine, is that Western medicine has really gotten to the point where doctors are so specialized in their trainings that they're just treating one thing. If there's something wrong with your heart, they're going to treat the heart. But Chinese medicine does the opposite. Chinese medicine tries to treat what's interacting with the heart and they're trying to figure out, like, what are the symptoms? Let's treat the symptoms instead of just targeting, one particular organ or one particular part of the body and trying to fix that. So, I'm not bashing Western medicine. I use it. It's important. We all do. We need it. But it's just a sort of a different approach to how you can view the human body. And I think as a yoga teacher, it's just really important for us to view the human body as a vessel that is just filled with all of these interactive forces. And those interactive forces are blood, lymphatics, which are super important for immunity. That's all helping drive your chi energy, right? Which is all the energy inside and out. All of it's interacting, okay? So hopefully that one example is a good segue into all the other stuff that we're going to talk about with the human body. All right, so now let's get into the actual structural components of the human body. So we start typically with cavities. So this figure is showing you the different cavities, and then sometimes we lump certain cavities together, and just for ease and to facilitate, separating them all out. So the head, basically your brain case, is the cranial cavity. So it's all the bones that are holding in your brain. And then you have your vertebral cavity, which is essentially your spine. And then you have your pleural cavity, which is your lungs. And anytime you see pleural, it's always going to be associated with your lungs, like pleurisy, which is inflammation of the lining of the lungs. You also have your diaphragm here. You can see that is separating out some of these cavities, the lower and upper torso. The pericardial cavity, which is the cavity that houses the heart, lies just above the diaphragm, but also just to the left of the mediastinal line. So this is your mediastinal line, because this is the midline of the body. And we'll talk more about those in a minute. So your heart is lying just above the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is that very thin skeletal muscle that lies just below your ribs, and it's a dome-shaped muscle. So make sure you can see me. So it's a dome-shaped muscle, and as you breathe in, inhale, it expands out, makes more room for the ribs, makes more room for air, and then as you breathe back out, exhale, it goes back to the dome shape. So this muscle is essentially separating out your upper and lower torsos. Then you also have your abdominal cavity, which is essentially your stomach and all of your visceral organs. And viscera mean hollow internal organs, so that would be things like your bladder, your large intestine, your small intestine, your stomach. Then you have your abdominopelvic cavity, and I mentioned that sometimes we lump these together. So the abdominopelvic cavity would include your abdominal cavity and your pelvic cavity. So your pelvic cavity is here below your abdominal cavity. Okay, so that's basically your pelvic floor that we talk about in yoga. And that pelvic floor is containing your bladder, all of your reproductive organs, and your rectum. So when you tell people in your yoga class, lift up through your pelvic floor, squeeze your pelvic floor, most people don't know what that means. So oftentimes you can use the analogy, pretend like you're stopping your flow of urine mid-pee or mid-urine, and then everybody gets it, like, oh, okay, yeah, I've done that a million times. And so then you're squeezing the pelvic floor and you're strengthening all those muscles. So in yoga, the abdominal pelvic cavities and the pelvic cavities are really, really important, two of the most important. And then you have your ventral body cavity, which is basically your front cavity. And then you have your dorsal cavity, which is your back. So ventral means belly. In yoga, we call this prone if we're lying on our belly. And dorsal means back. And in yoga, we typically call this supine. So like if you're lying down on a supine twist, you're on your back. But if you're in a prone savasana, you're on your belly. You can also further delineate the parts of the body by regions. So the regions are a little bit more specific within each of those cavities. So all of the upper regions are right hypochondriac, epigastric, and left hypochondriac. Those are all the ones that are going to be associated with your thoracic cavity, which really includes like all of your rib cage, your heart, that's all thoracic. And that's named from the thoracic spine, which is the middle part of your back. So that's all your thoracic cavity. So right hypochondriac and then left hypochondriac are going to be in that upper sides or lateral parts of the thoracic cavity. And then you have the epigastric region, and epi means above, on top of. So your epigastric region is essentially sitting on top of your stomach. And then just below that, you have the umbilical region, which is named after your umbilical cord, which is right at your belly. And these are also associated with chakras and all kinds of really cool yoga terms. You have your right and your left lumbar regions, and lumbar refers to the low back. So if you're thinking about your lumbar spine, those are your lower 5 vertebrae. That's what this is named after. So you have left and right, just like you have the left hypochondriac and right hypochondriac. And then underneath your umbilical region, you have your hypogastric. And so hypo means below. This is also called the pubic region, which would be associated with your pelvic cavity. So this is named from the pubic bone. And hypo, below, gastric, stomach. It's like a gastropub. It's an easy way to remember it. So a gastropub is a pub that also serves food. So gastro, food, stomach. And then you have your right iliac and left iliac regions. And these are down below. These are inferior. And basically iliac is referring to the iliac crest on the ilium, which is your big hip bone that curves up, and you can feel that iliac crest, that kind of shelf structure that you're feeling on your bone, that's your iliac crest. So the hypogastric is basically down at your pelvic floor. The epigastric is up higher, and the umbilical is right in the belly, and then everything else is lateral. So those are the 3 medial regions, and then you have your left and right, and those are the lateral. So medial is middle, and lateral is side. Okay, so those are just other ways to delineate the different parts of the body. And then finally, we can delineate by planes. And this one is important for yoga in terms of movement. And we're going to have another lecture and lesson on movement of body parts and how different yoga poses will move you through these different planes. But first, I just want to orient us to, all of these things, and then we'll get into more details about how they're related specifically to yoga. So one of your planes is called the frontal plane. So if you think about this, think about frontal plane cuts front and back. So essentially you're cutting your body down and you're separating the ventral and dorsal sides. So ventral belly, remember prone, dorsal on the back, like jaws, dorsal fin. So the frontal plane is cutting you in half, separating your front and your back. Your medial or mid-sagittal plane is cutting you in half, and it's taking apart your right and your left side. And this one has other names as well, but mid-sagittal is the most common. This one highlights median as the most common, but in anatomy we typically call it the mid-sagittal. But both are correct. There's lots of, in anatomy, there's so many different names for everything. It can be a little confusing. The transverse plane is basically cutting your body in half and separating your inferior and superior sides. Okay, so that's separating your top from your bottom. So inferior, superior, above, below, medial, middle, lateral, sides. So these planes are essentially dividing the human body in ways that is separating front, back, side to side, and top, bottom. Okay, and as a result, in yoga, you can literally talk about which planes, or know, you might not ever talk about it in your classes, but you will know as a yoga teacher which yoga poses are super important for your classes, especially if you want to do a full body workout. Because if you're doing a full body yoga class, then you're going to need to move through all 3 planes. You're going to need to do some forward folds, extensions, side bends, and rotations. And all of those are moving through different planes. So we'll get to that in a little more detail. So hopefully this is helpful, and you will be able to use some of this terminology as you grow as a yoga teacher. Well, all right, and finally, I just want to go through the different systems to make sure that everybody's clear on what organs are associated with each system. And we already talked a lot about those intricate relationships between the systems. So we don't need to go into that here, but I do want you to understand what organs are associated with what system. So these pictures highlight particular organs that belong to the system. So the first one highlights the skin and the hair. Also the nails, that's your integumentary system. So I mentioned skin earlier in the lecture, and your skin is the largest organ of the human body, and it houses tons of blood vessels, lots of specialized cells. It houses lots of nerves, and it allows our sensory system to send messages to the brain, and then the brain can integrate that information and send it back out to the motor system or glands or other cells in the body, target cells. So the skin is really that outer shell that's providing this vessel for all of these amazing things to happen. The next system is the skeletal system. So it's highlighting your pelvic girdle, which is your hip girdle, and your spine and your ribs. And then you have your muscular system, which is highlighting some of the muscles along the side body and ribs. The next one, D, is highlighting your nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. And notice those little nerves that are coming out of the spine. Those are called your spinal nerves. And then you have that big cluster that I was talking about, the horse's tail, down at the bottom. And you also have cranial nerves that come out of your brain. This system is your endocrine system, which is associated with your hormones. So the endocrine system has glands that are producing or excreting hormones, and hormones are released into your bloodstream. And then they basically help drive pretty much all of our metabolic functions, our growth, our sleep. Hormones pretty much make us who we are. And, they can change our moods. They can cause acne. They can, they pretty much do everything. So the endocrine system is also very tightly linked to the nervous system, because these two systems, D and E, are considered the two control systems of the human body. So the nervous system also has organs and glands that start to produce hormones and messages to the endocrine system. So they're tightly linked in that way. They're kind of like a highway that leads into a smaller road, and then it leads into smaller roads with the blood vessels where the hormones are, and the hormones are being circulated. So that's pretty awesome. Then you have your circulatory system, which includes your heart and your cardiovascular system, which are your blood vessels and your blood. So the three components of the cardiovascular system are blood, blood vessels, and heart. And obviously, if you've taken my yoga classes before, I talk all the time about blood and the healing components of blood, which is primarily oxygen, but lots of other things too. And blood does so much. It has so many functions. It regulates our temperature. It regulates our water volume. It has lots of important proteins and other solutes, specifically proteins that help with blood clotting, for example, proteins that help with your immunity, antibody production, all kinds of things happening. And then, of course, I talked about your red blood cells having to acclimatize to higher elevations where the air is thinner. So your cardiovascular system is circulating all of those red blood cells. And then within the blood, you also have white blood cells, lots of different kinds. There's many varieties of your white blood cells, and they're all kind of doing their own thing. The next one is showing your lymphatic system, which is my second most favorite system. And this is the system that's tightly linked to your immune system. So you have your lymph nodes, your lymphatic vessels, your spleen, your thymus, and bone marrow. That's the other big one. So these organs and structures essentially run in conjunction with your cardiovascular system. But one thing that's really cool about the lymphatic system is it's actually a heartless system, so it's a pumpless system. the cardiovascular system has a heart that's literally pumping blood, right? Pumping oxygen out to your cells. But lymphatics, super important because they're essentially carrying your immunity, right? You're carrying lymph in your lymphatic system, and lymph is healing, right? It's a healing fluid in the body, but it doesn't have a heart, so it essentially has to hijack the heart of the cardiovascular system. So the lymphatic system, its vessels are running primarily in conjunction with your cardiovascular system, so it can basically get movement of the lymph through from the beating of your heart and also the movement of your muscles as well. Then you also have your respiratory system. The lungs, of course, are the primary organ for the respiratory system, but you also have other ones. You have the pharynx, you have the trachea, you have the bronchi, you have the alveoli. All of these structures are associated with respiration and breathing and capturing oxygen. And hopefully you remember from me talking a little bit about digestion, how you eat food, you send the glucose, or send the food down into the body, and then of course it breaks it all down, turns it into glucose, and then that glucose goes out into the bloodstream. Well, where does that oxygen come from? The oxygen comes from respiration. So we breathe in the oxygen from the air given to us by the beautiful plants, and then open it up, exhale all the CO2 out, and guess what? Those beautiful plants are breathing in our CO2. This is a beautiful cycle in our ecosystem. It's basically Earth, yeah? And then you have your digestive system, which we've already talked about extensively. You have the stomach, the large intestine, the small intestine, the pancreas, the esophagus, and there's some other, the appendix is associated with your digestive system and other accessory organs as well. The liver is also considered an accessory organ to the digestive system. So digestive system, again, is really, really complicated. Complex, I guess, is probably a better word than complicated. Complicated makes it sound like it sounds bad, right? But complex, it's sophisticated for sure. Then you have your urinary system, which you may have heard this called the excretory system before. So urinary system is your kidney, your ureters, your bladder, and the kidneys, of course, are taking urine from the bloodstream, from your cardiovascular system, and then pulling out all the waste, the things that we don't want, and we want to excrete out. So turning blood into urine, that's exactly what the kidneys are doing. And then, of course, the bladder is the container holding the urine until it's excreted out the urethra. And then you finally have your reproductive systems. So the first one is showing the male reproductive system, which is essentially the penis and the gonads, which for males is testicles, and some other associated organs. And then for females, female reproductive system is the uterus, the cervix, the ovaries, which are the gonads for females. The ovaries are producing the eggs. The testicles in males are producing the sperm. And then when egg and sperm meet, fertilization happens, and that's how we make babies. And then the breasts are also considered a component of the female reproductive system. Right, now we're going to move on to one of my favorite topics, and it's essentially how the body starts to maintain what we call homeostasis. And in essence, homeostasis literally is how we maintain life. So homeostasis means balance or equilibrium. That's what it essentially means. Homeostasis is just a fancy word to say that. But there's a lot of components that are associated with maintaining that balance in the human body. And one of those components is your sensory input system, or your afferent nervous system. And then, of course, you have your central nervous system, which is considered to be your site of integration. So the central nervous system is receiving messages from your sensory system. And then your brain is integrating the message and sending that message out, the motor system, or the efferent system. And then it's telling the body what to do. So in this particular example, the man is looking at the glass of water. The water is a stimulus. That water is stimulating thirst. So there's some kind of sensory input that's coming in, probably visual in this case, right? Because he's not drinking it, he's looking at it. So this water is somehow tapping into his visual sensory system. So there's sensory nerves in his eyes that are being excited by the water, which then in turn starts to cause his mouth to water. He realizes he's thirsty. The brain starts to integrate that information, telling him he's thirsty, right? And then, of course, all the things happen when you get thirsty. Then you get even thirstier because you realize your mouth is dry and then your mouth starts watering. So the brain is really the center, or you can think about it like the bank of a big city, the center bank. It's like kind of doing all the processing, okay, like a data bank. And then once the brain processes that sensory information, the brain's going to tell our muscles what to do. And in this case, through the motor output, it's going to tell the muscles, hey, you're thirsty, pick up the water. So it's going to use all the muscles in the arm. It's showing the biceps here. The biceps are going to reach forward, pick up the water, and you're going to take a drink. Okay, so that's your efferent motor system and the afferent sensory system. Those are your two primary systems that are maintaining this internal homeostasis. And the sensory input and motor output is driven by peripheral nerves. So do you remember those spinal nerves that I showed you in that other slide? Those nerves coming out of the vertebrae? Those are your spinal nerves. That is your peripheral nervous system. And your brain and your spinal cord are your central nervous system. So central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord. Brain is the center of integration. The spinal cord is primarily dictating reflex arcs. So like if, when you go to the doctor when you're little and you hit your knee to see if your knee jerks, that's a reflex arc. So it's not quite integration of information, it's a reflex of that particular stimulus, okay? So this is one example of how those systems work together. Then what you have to consider is something called a feedback. And when you think about feedbacks, it literally is this mechanism by which our body can come out or back into this equilibrium or homeostasis. So when you think about a feedback, they can be positive or negative, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference, and I'll use some examples. But a feedback system essentially is a regulatory mechanism. So if you think about here, like this is where the stimulus, right, is going to produce the change, right? So the stimulus of the water in the last slide is going to produce a change. He's going to get thirsty. So the stimulus, whatever it is, you put your hand over a hot flame, woo, take it away. I'm going to jerk my hand away because it's hot. That's your brain telling your muscles, your effectors, to literally take the hand off the flame. So if your body is in homeostasis, then this variable is even. So it's like a teeter-totter with two evenly weighted children on it. But that stimulus that's associated with something happening, right, that the brain is integrating is going to shift. It's going to change it. It's going to go this way or it's going to go this way. So the kid now weighs more than the other kid. This kid weighs less. So it's off of that balance. So some of us have a more narrow window of homeostasis than others. So for me, like I have to pretty much eat all day long so that I don't get too hungry, and then I get kind of low blood sugary and I get kind of headachy. That might happen to you too. Some of us get hangry and grouchy. That might also be a symptom of that. But I eat all day long to try to avoid that because I know that I have this narrow window of homeostasis for food. Some people have it for sleep. Do you know anybody that, doesn't get their 8 or 9 hours of sleep for one night and they're just so grouchy you can't even tolerate them? But then there's other people that can go 5 or 6 days without hardly any sleep and they're still fine and they're still kicking, right? So every individual is different, and that's also important for yoga teachers to appreciate, because what one person tells you, another person might have told you something very similar, but it manifests very differently. Like they might have a similar disease, or they might both have celiac disease, or they might both have, high blood pressure, or they might both have depression. Any of those things are going to potentially manifest very differently in different people. So this offset, right, of that balance is when the body comes out of homeostasis. That is driven by the stimulus. And then you have the change that's detected by those sensory receptors that I talked about. And then you have the input information that goes to the control center, which is your brain, point of integration. Then you have the output information, brain telling muscles what to do. And then you have the response of the effector, which is the muscle actually doing what the brain tells it to do. That's the response, okay? And then full circle, if the arm is going to reach out, grab the water, take a drink because it's thirsty, then you are going to basically get back to that homeostasis because your body needs water, you got water, and it's all balanced out. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. These are the components of any kind of feedback system. But there's two different kinds of feedback system. One is a negative feedback system, and one is a positive, as I mentioned. And the negative feedback system you can think about as a regulatory system. So you can see this now becomes a feedback loop. Whereas on the last slide, the slide before this, it was the feedback system telling you the components. But now we have what's called a feedback loop. So we get out of the homeostasis, here's the stimulus, and then let's say you have high blood glucose levels, so you have too much sugar in your blood. The pancreas is going to respond by producing insulin that is going to then basically meet up with or talk to, cells signal each other, they talk to each other, talk to these cells that can start to take up more glucose, okay? So that's what the insulin is doing. The insulin itself isn't taking up the glucose, the insulin is talking to cells and telling those cells to uptake the glucose. The liver then takes up the glucose that the cells are also taking up, but any excess is being taken up by the liver, so both things are working, and the liver stores that glucose. And so the blood glucose level then is going to go down, okay? So you have a spike in the blood glucose, and then you have the pancreas secreting insulin, and then you have the cells, and you have the liver that are essentially uptaking, and as a result, then the blood glucose level is going to go down, all right? So then it's a little bit off of homeostatic balance at that point. So let's say it goes too low below the threshold of being in homeostasis. Then you have low blood glucose levels, and then you basically have glucagon releasing cells also from the pancreas. The pancreas is amazing because if you have too much glucose in the blood, the pancreas can secrete insulin, and if you have too low of glucose levels in the blood, your pancreas can secrete glucagon. And these are essentially both hormones that can regulate your blood glucose levels. Why is this so important? Hopefully you remember me talking about ATP production. That all comes from glucose. So if we have too much or too little glucose, it can kind of wreak havoc on homeostatic balance in the body, and then it's going to start to affect the energy that we have. So your energy, is going to spike, and then it's going to crash, or it's going to be too low. All right. So the glucagon then is going to talk to the liver, and then the liver is going to start to break down that glycogen that it's stored that I mentioned up here. So all the glucose gets stored in the liver. I think I mentioned that. I meant to if I didn't. But the liver takes in the excess glucose, and it's going to store it there. And then it's going to put those glucose chain molecules together and make a chain of something called glycogen, which is basically a long chain of glucose. That glycogen is stored for when your body needs it. So when you're running low on those reserves, then your liver can release the glycogen and then break it down, body breaks it down back into the glucose, back into the bloodstream, and voila, you essentially get the blood glucose level going back up and maintaining that teeter-totter balance, okay? Does that make sense? Hopefully. I hope so, okay? So if you're still kind of struggling with that example, it's a little bit of a complicated example, but I wanted to give you a real-life biological example. But let me give you another example that might make a little bit more sense. And then you can maybe understand this one a little bit better if you're struggling. It's just like a thermostat. All right, so I own hot yoga studios. So this is something we always have to deal with. It's like, oh, okay, temperature gets up to a certain temperature, or the room gets up to a certain temperature, and then there's some mechanism that's going to kick on and try to bring it back down to whatever it's set for. So everything has a set point. So let's say I want to run a hot yoga class at 100 degrees. So I set the thermostat at 100. So it's going to blow the heat until it gets to 100. Okay? If it overshoots 100, then there's another mechanism that's going to turn on to basically lower that temperature back down to 100. Same thing, if you set your room temperature for 72, that's your comfort level, that's your homeostasis for your own body, then same thing, you set your thermostat at 72, right? But it's not perfect, just like the human body, it's not perfect, it's teetering around 72, right? And that's why your AC kicks on and off all day long, is because it's working to maintain that 72. Well, that 72 temperature, or that 100, if that's, what you set it at, is this. And then your room is going to be going up and down, all day long. So that's what your body is doing. So your body is producing insulin when it needs it and glucagon when it needs it to lower or raise those glucose levels. Okay, so hopefully that analogy also helped. Then you also have what's called positive feedbacks. And a positive feedback essentially is when you have a stimulus that produces something and it continues to happen while the stimulus is present. So a good example of this is blood clotting. You basically break or tear a blood vessel, and then your clotting occurs as the platelets start to adhere to the site of the chemicals. And the platelets come from the blood, so they're called in by other cells. Remember I mentioned cells talk to each other, so this is called cell-cell signaling. They come in, they clot, and that clotting, they're going to keep coming as long as you're bleeding. So bleeding is the stimulus. The feedback cycle is going to end when the blood stops, all right? And then the clotting is going to proceed until the break is sealed completely, and then you basically are going to go back into that cycle. You're going to heal, and then when you're cut again, the cycle is going to continue. So this is considered a positive feedback loop. Let me give you another example. Uterine contractions for childbirth is a positive feedback. So when the baby needs to come out, the uterine contractions will occur, and they will continue until the baby comes out. And then another positive feedback that follows that is the birth of the placenta, the afterbirth. Okay? So once the baby's out, once the placenta's out, then those contractions will stop and the feedback will end. Another good example is breastfeeding. So when a mom is breastfeeding a baby, the suckling on the nipple is the stimulus, and the milk is going to continue to be produced as long as the baby is suckling, because your body has a mechanism. It's not like the milk is going to run out, right? I mean, for some women it does, but if you're in balance and you're producing enough milk, as long as that baby's sucking, then your milk is going to keep being produced, okay? That's positive feedback. And then when the suckling stops, then your body knows to stop producing the milk, okay? So those are all ways that your body amazingly maintains homeostasis. And the reason I talk to you all, yoga teachers, about homeostasis, because I think it's so important for you to understand to lead a really good yoga class. You don't ever have to talk about it, but if you know what it means and you understand that our bodies are always striving to be at this equilibrium, that means that that's our healthy point for everything. Water balance, food, digestion, blood glucose levels, blood clotting if we get cut. So all these feedback mechanisms are basically keeping us healthy and keeping us feeling good. So people that come into your yoga classes that maybe feel terrible, they tell you they feel bad, they don't know what's wrong with them, they're struggling, they've got some kind of imbalance. And who knows what it is? I usually refer my people to my acupuncturist. If it's something like super serious and like it's pretty like easy to detect what's going on, then you can say, well, have you talked to your doctor? We're not doctors. I mean, I'm a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. We don't give diagnoses as yoga teachers, but we can certainly like understand the human body to the point where we can try to help our students by saying, hey, maybe you might want to think about seeing an acupuncturist or a Chinese medicine doctor, or have you seen your doctor? Most people have traditional doctors. I don't personally, but most do. And so you can say, have you seen your doctor? Maybe you need to. And so understanding how the body balances and how these feedback systems work, I think is really important for yoga teachers. And also just how your nervous system is working to control those feedbacks. And of course, it's working with the endocrine system, hormones, hormone production, all feedbacks, okay? So I know this is a lot of information. It's all introductory material, but I think it's super important to get a nice broad overview of the study of human anatomy. And I hope that you will fall in love with anatomy as much as I have. And if not, that's okay. I still love you. And please, please, please let me know if you have any questions about anything that I lectured over today. Thank you.